Picture this. Underneath the margins, your words can breathe. Got your listeners tilting isosceles the way you holding volcanic quills, spitting decrees. Better believe it flows like these. You got gills, screaming at daffodils or dreaming in mandrills, derivative of skills. You're built in the workshop, rocking with Ra. Cause in life, the woodshed don't stop. It don't stop. It don't stop. Don't stop. Some ideas, they shake you out of your sleep like when a toddler creeps. Totality of the deep, the mere thought of an unconscious manifestation carried out with the beat. Positive charged protons creating neural explosions. Time hiccups when fingers and pads touch. Dead air smiles because it knows what's coming. The countenance of the clock claps hands. The choreography of the knot slaps jams. And you be like, who made this? Vertebrae responding to the call so bad to make a B-girl curve the wall. To the SP1200, the blue light bulb, to the board, the engineer's hands, and the limited well of patience. Hallelujah to everybody say ho, amen to all the ladies say ow. Thank God for make money, money, make money, money, and bless every hand that was ever put in the air. In your name, we pray.
What's going on, family? It's yours truly, Mazi Mutafa, Executive Director of Words, Beats, and Life, here for day number 4 of this week, anyway, of the Alternative Winter Break. If you've been tuning in, you know that these conversations have been amazing, learning about what's inspired some of the country's greatest media artists, authors, and creators. Today, I have one of my mentors here who probably doesn't even know he's a mentor because I've just been studying from a distance, watching what he's been doing in terms of publishing, but also organizing, bringing communities together in conversation about the power of hip-hop and the power of hip-hop communities to transform the conditions in which we live. It's my honor to introduce to all of you my good brother, Bakari Kitwana.
Peace.
How's it going, brother?
All right.
Thanks so much for being with us. I know that you are in the midst of doing a whole bunch of things, including I saw you were doing something yesterday on Clubhouse.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was my Clubhouse debut yesterday.
And you decided to go in like all in. I saw the list of folks that you had that were going to be.
Yeah, we had a pretty crazy lineup. I mean, I kind of felt like we needed to make a big splash. So had Joe out, Dave Mays from The Source, producer Cardo, Meezy, manager for 21 Savage, Jasiri, X of One Hood, and Treva Lindsay, professor at Ohio State University, Women's Studies, and she teaches classes on hip hop. So that was the crew. It was good though. It was a good conversation. The topic was hip hop, pandemic, and innovation. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. You always come with the most relevant topic of the moment, whether that was something around the election or now the pandemic. You're always at the cutting edge of conversation about the ways in which hip-hop communities can engage and be resources.
Yeah, I mean, I try to think about what is the most relevant thing we should be talking about right now, and also never to dumb it down. Because I feel that people are, our people are instinctive intellectuals. And so I feel like we just talk about it where it is. I think, that's how I grew up as a young person. People just taught and they talked and you just had to catch up. And so that's kind of, I feel like how it goes, but we try to, keep it on the cutting edge of what's happening, and always blending politics and hip hop.
Well, so that's really exciting, especially because that's where you are right now. But let's do this. Let's start this conversation maybe back at the beginning, and even before your beginning. I wonder. I've been starting all these conversations off by asking about people's family and how much they know about their family.
Right.
And that's been interesting. Like Jessica Caramore was on yesterday and talked about her blood family, but also like her intuitive family, the people that she knows that are part of that tree, but she doesn't know their names or where they were from in every instance. I wonder how much do you know about your own family tree?
Man, it's funny. I spent a lot of time, probably about 25 years ago, might have been longer than that, might have been 30 years ago, tracing my family tree before it was fashionable for people to do their genealogy. And my family, my parents, I'm from Long Island. My parents moved to Long Island in 1955. I was born in 66. They, you know, they were stunned by the Emmett Till situation. My mom actually just decided she wasn't going back to the South. They were born in North Carolina, Elizabeth City area, in the Outer Banks area, and they were primarily farm laborers. My mom's parents were from there. Their grandparents, and going back, my family on both sides, I think my earliest ancestor, I traced on my own to early 1800s, I think 1818. And so they were, they were enslaved, and they were, some of them were in shipping. That Outer Banks area, the coast there, Elizabeth City area is actually a naval area. A lot of my family grew up and were Navy folks. I have ancestors who fought in both World War I and World War II. And so they were laborers, and my parents were migrant workers. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that television. The movie with Erykah Badu and what's the brothers in there? Heavy D is in there, right? Heavy D and Erykah Badu, and the Cider House Rules. And that was my parents. They were migrant workers. They would farm sweet potatoes in North Carolina, and then they would come up in the summers and fall into the fall and farm white potatoes in Long Island. And so just one year, my mom was just like, I'm not going back. And so they moved. They would leave their kids, then my older brother and my older sister, with my father's mother, and then they would go up for 2-3 months and then come back. So one year, my mom said she wasn't going back. My father wanted to go back. He gets back, and my grandmother's like, listen, you better go get your wife, because I'm not going to be taking care of these kids any longer. So my father got the kids, came back to Long Island, and we've been in Long Island ever since.
Wow. That's a completely unique story so far. To be honest, I didn't even know, and I feel terrible for not knowing this, that migrant workers came from the South to the North to farm. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah, that was a thing. Yeah, that was a thing. It was a big thing. So yeah, that, of course, before we get into the era in which, people are coming up from, other parts outside of the country. But certainly in those early days, like, there were migrant workers going up even as far as, Massachusetts and even Vermont, I believe. But my parents were to Long Island. My parents didn't feel New York City. So it's like they got to New York City, they're like, nah, because they were down south country folks. And so they was like, this ain't it. So they decided that, yeah, Long Island was a place that they could really live. And actually, I was born in Southampton, of what people call the Hamptons, what we call the other Hamptons. There's a very vibrant old Black community out there, several ways of migration. My families came in the 30s. There was an earlier wave of Black folks out to that area, Southampton, East Hampton, Bridgehampton, Sag Harbor. I want to say that had to have been in the 30s. And we would meet some of those folks. But many of the families that I knew growing up were my cousins. My mom, her sister, their first cousins. So I grew up with a lot of my second cousins. We played on like sports teams together, primarily basketball. There's actually a film made about my high school basketball team that was produced by Shaquille O'Neal. And the film was called The Killer Bees. And so I played on 3 my years of high school on those teams, and I believe we won 2 New York State championships. We went to the states all 3 times. We lost the first year, then we won the second 2 years. But big basketball town. Many of the folks on the team were my cousins. I think 1 year, I want to say it was at least 5 of us. So it was kind of bugged out, but a small town, everybody kind of knew everybody. I go out there now, I can be driving down. It's like a couple of streets that's basically the Black community in each of these towns. I can drive down some of these streets and I can see some of these kids that I don't even know, but I can recognize their facial features and almost point out what family they're from. So kind of a bugged out situation, but that's kind of the whole story in a nutshell.
Well, so what's funny about almost all these conversations, everyone jumps to high school. Let's go all the way back though, because we started with your moms and your dad, and your grandmother and the role that she played in helping to raise you all early on. Can you remember what's your earliest memory of doing something creative, whether that was whatever that is, your earliest creative memory?
I used to write when I was like in the 2nd or 3rd grade. And my siblings used to make fun of me. I would write these stories, and I really didn't have a lot to say, but I didn't like to be hot. I didn't like to be too hot. So I used to write these stories that would talk about how hot it was, and they would make jokes about it. They thought it was funny, but so no one was surprised when I ended up being a writer, because that was a part of just something that I started doing at a very early age. I was reading a lot at a young age. Outside of that, I mean, I read a lot, I wrote a lot, but outside of sports, I wouldn't say I was very creative. Couldn't really draw or anything like that. I can remember when one of my cousins who lived 2 doors down from me first got his DJ equipment, and I would go over to his house and be fooling around with it. But I didn't really have an instinct for that either. So, no, I can't think of it. I mean, it's a good question.
That was a great answer though, because it's so funny. Like, one of the things about being a young creative is that we often diminish what it is that we did because it didn't live up to whatever we thought it was supposed to be.
Well, as you're talking, one of the other things that I did, growing up in Long Island, in Bridgehampton, we all did. I grew up pretty much in a Black existence. People hear the Hamptons and they think, oh, it's this exclusive area. I mean, we saw that, but we didn't live that. So like the church I went to was Black. The high school I went to was 95 to 98% Black. The my neighborhood, the street that I lived on, everyone was Black. So but in my high school we had primarily white teachers. I had 2 Black teachers my whole childhood. But going to church, my parents were into the church, and so we went to church and sang on the choir and acted in the Christmas plays and things of that nature. So, that was, I guess, a little bit of a creative streak. 1 year, I think I played like a judge or an attorney. Me and my cousin both. I can't remember. One was the judge, one was the attorney, but I can't really remember all the details. But that was the extent of my acting debut.
No doubt. I mean, but to be honest, the writing that you were doing, to me, I would qualify that as a creative act. The idea that you're using your imagination to tell the stories. What was one of the things I'd love to know about that 2nd grade Bakari was, if your cousins were clowning you about it, how did you find encouragement to keep writing?
Well, it wasn't my cousins; it was my sisters and brothers. So I have, there are 8 of us. I actually had a brother who passed. It was 9 of us, but it was 8 of us for most of my life, and all of them. And the other thing about my parents is neither one of my parents finished high school. My father went to the 2nd grade. My mother went to the 10th grade. But they were education fanatics. Like something had happened in their lives that early on, that they knew the power of what education could mean for us and they impressed that upon us. So all of my siblings are college graduates, but we were the first generation on both sides of my family to do that. But so yeah, so my siblings would clown me because you in a big family, and I have a younger sister. Everyone else was older, so the older ones, like my brothers, are 8 and 9 years older than me, so they would constantly clown me. The upside of that is you get tough skin pretty early, which as a writer, that's what you need. I see people now who write, they get into these. I never get into online arguments. You know what I'm saying? Because as a writer, you learn early. You're not going to be able to argue with everybody who doesn't like something you said or doesn't agree with something you said. And so I think I kind of got that instinct, growing up in a big family.
No doubt. Brother has made you tough. So you talked about having only two African-American teachers in your K through 12. Yeah, I'm curious. Right. Can you think back to a teacher that maybe encouraged that writing, whether that was middle school or high school? Who was a good question you along the way?
I had such an amazing cadre of teachers, man. I went to, I mentioned I grew up in Bridgehampton, and Bridgehampton is a village in the town of Southampton. And my teachers were, pretty much all white, except for these two teachers that I had. But they were great people, man, and they poured so much into the kids, and they gave me a lot of hands-on. We were a small school. Like my graduating class, I think, was like maybe 12 students. And so it was basically because we're in this kind of resort area, and the Black families, they're just living there. Many of the millionaire home type people, they're just coming out for the summer. So it was an area that had a huge tax base, and that tax base supported the high school. The high school I went to was K through 12. A lot of teachers, man, that I remember. I had a science teacher named Mr. Trages, and he was very hard on me, but very brutally honest. And so, he would talk to me about things like, he would be saying to me, as a young Black man, you can't get caught up in sports. You got to focus on your books. Like, he would say things like that to me. And at first I was like, who is this guy? And why does he think he can say this to me? But he'd also taught both of my older brothers. And there was an English teacher. Her name was Nancy Seitz. She was just out of college, and she was a great teacher as well that I had. There was an English teacher I had before her who had passed. Man, I can't remember what her name is right now, but another woman who took great interest in me. Nancy Seitz would give me books to read, like Black Boy by Richard Wright, Claude Brown, Man-Child in the Promised Land, and Autobiography of Malcolm X. So I started reading these books because she could see that I was reading beyond, what was happening in the classroom. And she was like, you should read this. You should read. And so I read the stuff. So that was a big early influence. I'm trying to think of some of but my Black teachers, I had two Black teachers. One was my 4th grade teacher. Her name was Mrs. Humphreys. And Mrs. Humphreys was the first African-centered thinker that I had met. I mean, she was straight out of the 70s. She dressed in African garb. She rocked the natural, and she poured into us at an early age, what it meant to be Black. She played the guitar, and we would be sing. She'd have us singing songs and stuff in class to break up the monotony. And it was something about our class that she was fascinated by. So when we were ready for us to go to the 5th grade, I think there was an opening in the 5th grade. They were going to hire a new teacher. She's like, I want to be the 5th grade teacher. So she actually became my 4th grade teacher, and then also my 5th grade teacher. But she was amazing. She was wonderful. She was, very generous and very nice. There was another teacher, my Spanish teacher. I had 7th grade through 12th grade, the same a guy, Mr. Paradin was his name. He was Haitian. He had come to the United States. He was, really good with languages. He spoke both Spanish and French. He taught both. But he was one of the most just kind of pure-hearted, generous, and again, he poured so much into us. When I was in my I believe my sophomore year, he had decided that we should have a Spanish club. And so he's like, we're going to raise money and I'm going to take you guys to Mexico. And so that's what we did. So he was a big influence. He also was a musician, and he played, he had a band called the Merrymakers, and they would play around the Hamptons, during the summer. So I would see him around town in the summertime, but then also, he was my Spanish teacher. So another great influence and someone that really pushed me. I also had a guidance counselor who was a Black woman. So I can remember going through the process of applying for colleges, and she would sit with us and talk about schools and things of that nature. So those were some of the early influences. But I had a math teacher who was also amazing and spent a lot of time with me, like one-on-one. And that was the program there. They really poured into the students that they felt were serious and really trying to go to the next level. I also played saxophone as a kid. I guess that was creative. I started playing saxophone when I was in the second grade, I think, and I played it second grade through high school and had the same music teacher for that as well. And we did we played in different bands and stuff. And so that was another part of my early orientation.
All right, Bakari. So officially, every interview you do after this, if someone asks you when were you creative, you got to name the fact that you was a novelist as a child, you was in a choir, you were acting, you played the you got a whole lot of creativity for someone's like, I wasn't that creative.
Yeah, well, I guess I didn't look at it like that. It was just the stuff we were doing,
No doubt.
Yeah.
What I've loved so far in these interviews is that there's a few through lines. A lot of people played sport.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people that I'm talking to, and a lot of people also read the autobiography of Malcolm X or played records that had his speeches on it. So it feels like one of the things that I need to do after this is rewatch all these interviews and create a reading list.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That people that shape the lives of the folks, at least that I talked to in this series.
Yeah.
I wonder, because a big part of what, motivates us is the absence of guidance counselors in public schools today. And there's been studies about the fact that many schools use guidance counselors to do things like monitoring the hallways or monitoring lunch, as opposed to doing the kind of college prep work. I wonder how you feel like having the ability to engage with your school's guidance counselor to talk about college. And was that college in the context of sports, or was that college in the context of academics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like every class, as they were becoming seniors, maybe when it probably even did the junior year, she started talking with them. But I actually played baseball, basketball, and I ran cross country all my high school years. But my guidance counselor also she had me come to her house and do work for her. So I would go by her house and she'd have me in the yard, weeding and raking up the leaves and things like that. So I got to know her pretty well, and she took a great interest in me. So yeah, I mean, I think that the guidance counselor, I would say more so in terms of sports or not. I mean, a guidance counselor, she was definitely just thinking about college. Because I was on a basketball team that was relatively popular, we had a lot of interface with people that wanted, us to go play college ball. I had a couple of recruiters. One was Colgate University and a couple of other places. But my high school coach at the beginning of our senior year would ask us, like, are you guys serious about, playing sports in college? And I told him no, because already I was thinking that, I'm not like 6'7" or anything. And, I felt like I wanted to apply my mind. That was something I already was thinking about. I wanted to think about how, I think one of the things that my parents impressed upon me, because my father, they were laborers, and their parents were laborers, and their parents before them were laborers, and so forth and so on. And so they really impressed upon me that you can make a living with your mind. And so that was important to me. My father, after the farming stuff, kind of subsided, he was a mason. He was like bricklayer. He would do foundations for buildings and things of that nature. My mother worked as a nurse's aide in the hospital. And so, they were doing serious labor. But my mom was also a member of the 1199 union. She was very proud of that. She was a union member. And it's funny because as a kid, I didn't really understand what that meant. But as I got older and I started getting deeper into activism, I'm like, well, wait a minute, but she was really proud of that. So those were, some of the experiences. And the 1199 folks also had a scholarship in those days for some of their members' children. And so that was something I applied for as a student, thinking about college. So that all of those things were reinforced in college, as well as my teachers. And I don't know, in New York City, they have in those days, they had something called like the Regents scholarship that people would get, the Regent scholars. So it was already kind of a college bound track that they had. And so you were in that as a ninth grader. And I was aware of it because I had older brothers and sisters who had gone through school. That was a really great advantage for me as a student, going to the school where my brother went, who was 8. One of my brothers is 8 years older than me. One is 9. And so then, several sisters, in between, 3 sisters in between us and them, and all of them kind of schooling you along the way. So that stuff was I would say that was more influential than the guidance counselor, because when I chose colleges, I basically chose the schools that one of my older brothers had gone to. He went to Brown University. So I just basically applied I asked him, well, where did you apply to school? And so he told me. I wrote them all down, and those were the places basically that I applied to.
So I'm curious. Let's go ahead and get into the college experience. So high school, you're using your body to express yourself in terms of sports, but you decide in high school you want to do something different with your college career. So you decided to go to Brown. What did you major in?
Brown. I applied. I didn't get in.
Oh, what did you go to college?
I went to the University of Rochester. Yeah,
And
I said I applied to the schools that my brother applied to.
close listening. My bad.
Yeah.
So what did you, when you went to college, did you already have a major in mind, or can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah. Now, another thing about that was because I had older siblings who were in college, I can remember as a young man, young kid, really, basically, my parents would take my brother to school at Brown. And so they would either drive around Long Island to go through Connecticut and come around that way, or there's a ferry that runs between Orient Point, I think it's Greenport, New York, to New London, Connecticut. And we take this ferry. It's like a two-hour ferry or something. And we take this ferry over and then drive my brother to Providence. So I remember doing that and, kind of being on the campus and completely a foreign world. And the other thing is we played a Christmas tournament at Southampton College. And that was another thing that was man, this is amazing. We're on a college campus. So those kind of experiences, I think, started to kind of make me think that, it was something I wanted to do and that it was something that was possible. I don't know if that answered your question. I kind of moved away. Oh, you were asking me, how did what was I majoring in? It's funny. I took shop in school as well. That was something people used to do. I don't know if people do that now. And so my shop teacher was also my driver's ed teacher. And he was interested in architecture. And so me and him started talking about this, and he used to do some kind of drafting. So he had me doing drafting, I would just go meet with him one-on-one. And so I came out of high school not really knowing what to do. And so I was like, well, maybe I'll major in mechanical engineering. And so I started out at the University of Rochester majoring in mechanical engineering. I did that for my freshman year. And then I read James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, the summer of my freshman year. And that book captivated me so much. And I was like, this is what I want to do. And so that is how I then changed my major to English and then just kind of carried on from there.
And so what was it about? I mean, it's a seminal book, but what was it about the book that radically changed the direction of your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was just so moved by it. And I thought, if words can do, if this book, I guess at the time it was written, what, the 60s? And I remember thinking, and at this point it was the 80s, and I was thinking, man, you know, of course, when you're young, you think something 20 years ago was a long time. So I was like, if this book written so long ago can have this, you know, emotional kind of moving impact on me, like, this is powerful stuff. This is what I want to be able to do. I think it was what he was saying about race. It was what he was saying about the Black experience. And, you know, I ended up reading a lot of James. I think I've read most of James Baldwin's stuff. I actually did my master's thesis in English on James Baldwin. And this was 89. So, I mean, in those days, James Baldwin wasn't as fashionable as he's become in the last, you know, decade or so. But that was one of my early big influences.
And so I'm curious about particularly this undergrad and even graduate school, talking about the people. Like, a lot of the conversations I've had up to this point were about how in college, that's when some people's activism began, whether that was because of a BSU or a student government
Right.
association. You talked about learning about the organization that your mother was a part of,
Right.
through your activism. So did your activism begin in college?
I would say definitely. You know, I was a student activist. I was a vice president of the Black Student Union. I was a college student at the time when most college students were engaging in the anti-apartheid movement. So that was really how we cut our teeth as activists. And man, you know, being a part of the Black Student Union and, you know, working on the budgets and trying to get resources so we could bring the speakers that we wanted. We also started study groups. Really, we got the idea. I believe Kwame Ture was somebody who I met and I spent a lot of time with as a student. He was married to Miriam Makeba, and Miriam Makeba's sister lived in Rochester and was actually our advisor to the Black Student Union. And so when Kwame Ture, aka Stokely Carmichael, would come to town to visit us, to visit her, they would have us over for dinner. And so I got to spend a lot of time with him. That was a big influence, and to talk about the 60s movements and stuff. But as a college student and in these organizations, we began to encounter and interface with people in the movement, because we became aware that we have this budget. We can bring whoever we want. And so I remember we brought, I'm trying to remember what his name is now. He's the head of Julian Bond had come. We met, that's how I met Maulana Karinga for the first time. That's how I met Hakeem Adabuti, who I later worked for the first time, Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka, and many Farrakhan and many others, through bringing them to Bell Hooks, who's another big influence of mine. So yeah, so those the student activism was pretty much, primarily, a lot of it was around South Africa, but then some of the students who were women that I knew, they started something called the Black and Latino Women's Alliance. And so they were going real hard on the feminism, and they were making us as men feel real stupid if we didn't know this stuff. And so we started to read Bell Hooks, and then Bell Hooks came to campus, and I I've been friends with Bell Hooks since then, which is crazy. But she's been a big influence on me. She actually wrote cover comments for my first book, The Rap on Gangster Rap. So, yeah, the student activism was absolutely critical. And, you know, for a lot of people during those years, once you caught the bug of the student activism, you know, you were going to be an activist. It wasn't anything else you were going to do after that. So that was, and a lot of older students, some graduate students, some students who were seniors when we were freshmen and sophomore, they were kind of pulling our coat. I can remember as a freshman, my freshman year was the year that Louis Farrakhan had the big coming out at Madison Square Garden. And we were flirting with the nation in those days as undergraduates. There was a brother who was the head of the mosque in Rochester who had been a student at the University of Rochester. And so we were close with him, and we would go to the mosque and stuff on the meeting day. And he would then, he kind of pushed us like, hey, you guys should charter a bus and bring students to this meeting. So we did that. So those were some of the experiences that come to mind.
I'm curious because you're one of 9, and all of your siblings were also college students. Was that student leadership experience unique to you, or did any of your siblings have a similar experience?
You know, my brothers, you know, they're so much older than me. It wasn't something we ever really talked about. You know, my oldest brother is in the medical field. I've never really, you know, he was kind of a late bloomer around political issues and stuff. So I wouldn't imagine he was doing that. My oldest brother was an ROTC student. And so he wasn't very political as a student either. My sisters were activists. They were also Deltas. And so they actually impressed upon me about the whole history of Black fraternities and sororities. And so they went to school at the University of Buffalo. And so Buffalo and Rochester are like an hour apart. So when they were students, we'd go back and forth visiting and stuff. And so I got kind of the bug of the Black fraternity, and I pledged Kappa. And that was another big variable that influenced me as a student, because in those days on the predominantly white campuses, it was the Black fraternities and sororities that were also the activists on our campuses that I knew in the area. And so we were at the forefront of a lot of activism. I also started a newsletter paper for the Black Student Union that we called the Grapevine. It had existed back in the 60s, I think. It had gone defunct. And so I resurrected that. And that was one of the things I did. One of my earliest kind of editorial endeavors.
It's really so interesting how, and maybe it's just the circle of people I've invited is too small, but it feels like the creation of publications, the organizing, the using of university budgets, the roles of these stories seem so similar. And have produced some of the country's most important writers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've written some and researched some about the rise of Black students on predominantly white campuses, and just that whole wave of students after Dr. King was killed that come on to predominantly white campuses. The campuses kind of open up after that. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, the campuses kind of were trying to figure out how to do racial justice in a different way. And some of that was the demand for Black studies and Black faculty, but also it was more Black students on these campuses. And so that all of that stuff, I think, kind of happens at the same time. And for a while, many of those students are you know, students who are who come out of the African American experience, whose parents were you know, out of the South and had come to the North or wherever. And many of those students were those first kind of few generations when they seem to be a little bit more aggressively recruiting those students out of places like New York City and Long Island, et cetera, where we went to school upstate New York.
It was interesting because when I went to college, I was at the tail end of that aggressive effort. There used to be a scholarship at the University of Maryland called the Banneker Key Scholarship, which was
Okay.
basically used to give a full scholarship to African American students, particularly from cities like Baltimore and from throughout the state of Maryland.
Right.
I wonder, when you think about the work that you decided to produce post undergrad, post grad school, how do you think about the work that you do? Because so much of what you've been talking about up to this point is about community building and organizing and getting people attached to larger priorities. I have an opinion, but I wonder how you think about kind of the body of work that you've worked to create over the course of your career.
Man, you know, the writing to me, you know, when I was so I did 2 master's degrees at the University of Rochester after undergrad, and then in that year of graduate school, I got to know Haki Madabuti, who founded Third World Press, and Haki offered me a job when I was graduating, and I moved to Chicago and started working there. I was very interested in understanding the history of movement and trying to think about how to build a movement in our time. And so that was kind of what drove my reading, and also then it started to drive my writing. When I lived in Chicago and I worked at Third World Press, I was at Third World Press for 5 years. I worked as an editor in various capacities. I got to meet a ton of activists that heavily influenced me. Hannibal Afrique, who was a large part in Chicago of the independent Black school movement and Black curriculum in the city. People like Jacob Carruthers, who was a part of the Association for Classical African Civilizations, and one of the first folks within his group that started to read the hieroglyphs and teach other people how to read them. I mentioned Sonia Sanchez and Amiri Baraka. I got to spend time with them more through my work at Third World Press. So Third World Press kind of became formative for me, but also I met people when I was editing, I was Gil Scott-Heron's editor. And so I got to spend time with Gil Scott-Heron as we put his book together. So far, so good. I was editor for Francis Cress Welsing's The ISIS Papers. And so I worked on that project primarily with her sister. So those experiences really heavily shaped me. Chicago is an interesting place. Like I would run into Sam Greenlee walking down the street in Hyde Park. I would, my wife now, then my girlfriend, Lerone Bennett lived in her building, and I would encounter Lerone Bennett on the elevator. And so I would strike up these conversations with Lerone Bennett, and I would strike up conversations with all these old school activists, and they were schooling me. And so Lerone Bennett, I was asking him about writing and editing and how, because you know, Lerone Bennett was, he was in the early wave of folks who began to teach at the university as the Black Studies movement exploded. And one of the problems was they couldn't find people to teach, because they didn't know who they were. And so Lerone Bennett was already writing. He had already done the series, which was a series he published. He wrote this series of essays in Ebony, which ended up becoming his book Before the Mayflower, you know, basically making the argument that we were here, you know, before the Mayflower and so forth, similar to what's happening now with the 1619 argument. You know, so Lerone Bennett did that work back then. But Lerone and I would talk about publishing and editing, and I would be saying, man, what should I do? You know, I wanna, he's like, you gotta find out where your generation is, and you gotta be in conversation with your generation. So that is where I first started getting the idea that I should be at a hip hop magazine. That was Lerone Bennett influence that did that. So I worked at Third World Press for 5 years. I somehow finagled a meeting with the people at the Source And I ended up going to work at the Source magazine. So I did my first 5 years out of college at Third World Press. I left Third World Press. I taught briefly at the University of Houston and Texas Southern. And then from there, I went to the Source magazine. So, but that that was driven by my interest in understanding the history of Black political movement and trying to find my place within it.
So, at what point do you begin to do the work on the rap on gangster rap? Is this after or this before? During?
Rap on Gangster Rap is a book I wrote in my, I want to say it was in my last couple of years at Third World Press. That book came out in 1994, I think. I started writing that. It's funny because I ended up this last year doing this this fellowship at Harvard in the Hutchins Center, run by Henry Louis Gates, but also, of course, the Hip Hop Archive and Research Institute run by Marcelina Morgan. And so, but I actually started writing about hip hop because I was reading, I was reading everything that I could get my hands on. And at the time, Henry Louis Gates was one of the people, I'm trying to think of the other, two English professors, Henry Louis Gates and, oh my goodness, he wrote a book called Black Studies Rap in the Academy. Houston Baker. They were writing a lot about hip hop. And I was like, man, I know more about hip hop than these dudes. And so that was the impetus. The first thing I was working on was I was writing something on gun violence and how gun violence was affecting Black people. And then I kind of pushed that to the side and I started doing this work that was called the Rap on Gangster Rap. And so I basically wrote that book at night and on the weekends while I was working at Third World Press, editing Francis Cresswell Singh, editing Gil Scott Heron, and a bunch of other folks. And so, yeah, so that was kind of how my writing about hip hop began.
Well, it was interesting because I actually ordered that book in advance of this interview because I ordered all your books. And I didn't actually know about it before I found it for this interview.
Okay, I need to get my charger. I don't want to lose it. Sorry.
No problem.
I was hustling trying to be ready, and I forgot one of the main things.
It's all good. I'm glad
sorry.
Didn't lose the power.
Yeah, I'm just glad I had it close by.
Well, I was going to say that in reading that book, one of the things that struck me was what it felt like was your desire to basically explain hip hop to people who thought they understood it in a way that wasn't necessarily wasn't necessarily asking people not to see what was hideous about it, but to recognize that the hideousness didn't necessarily diminish the beauty. So this idea that, like, you could be a defender but not an apologist.
Right.
How do you feel like that book and the fact that how it was received set you up for the books that came after?
Yeah, it's crazy, man. I always tell people that you never know how a book is going to change you. You know what I'm saying? Like, a book is going to change your life, and you're not going to know until it's done. You know what I mean? And so that book radically changed my life. And I started writing it. I knew that I wanted to be a writer, which is why I wanted to be in editing, and I had been doing some of that as an undergrad. And so being at Third World Press took it to a different level. I got to meet people like Gwendolyn Brooks. And I mean, I spent a lot of time with Gwendolyn Brooks. She had a huge influence on me as a writer, but Haki, definitely the biggest influence of anyone. But I wrote this book. The book really, as I was on the way out at Third World Press, and then when I was at Third World Press, I had spent a lot of time with Gwendolyn Brooks. And one of the things that Gwendolyn Brooks would have me do is interface with her agent. And so Gwendolyn Brooks didn't fly. So she would take the train to do her gigs. And so she was doing these gigs. And so one of my tasks that she had me doing was to make sure her books was where she was going. And so that was the first time I kind of had the thought in my mind, like, man, as a writer, you get to write the books, but then you also get to go talk with people about the books, and then people are going to pay you to do that. And so that was the first time I started to think about it in that way. But that was because of Gwendolyn Brooks. So I wrote this book. Man, it's crazy because looking back on it, there weren't many people that were lecturing on hip hop. I remember maybe like Kevin Powell had already, I don't know if Kevin had already done The Real World at that point. I don't know if he had, maybe, I can't remember, but it was just a handful of us, maybe Kevin Powell, maybe, it was just a few people. Joan Morgan had already written When Chicken Heads Come Home. Nope, that came later too. So it was just a few people. And so I was the only one that I can remember that was really lecturing on hip hop and politics. That was something that I was interested in. And so I started with that. I wrote that book. That book then led me to being at The Source, because The Source had reviewed it. And then a little bit later, they had the big staff walkout. They were looking for a new editor. I was somebody that was new and completely out of the whole New York area because I was coming at that point from Chicago and Houston, and they needed new blood. They needed somebody to rebuild the staff, because a lot of people that had people that were a part of the walkout, whether writers or freelance writers, the publisher then banned them from ever writing for the magazine again. So we needed to rebuild an entire new staff. And so that was how I came to The Source. And I guess in terms of the writing, one of the things that we did at The Source was we would have these intense staff editorial meetings. And any editor would have to come to the table with the articles that they were proposing, and you would have to argue why this made sense. And so a lot of stuff I was doing was I was trying to talk about politics and hip hop. And so I got a lot of pushback. And so people would say to me, the recurring questions, what does this got to do with hip hop? What does this political issue have to do with hip hop? So I was constantly making the argument for how something had to do with hip hop. That kind of created that early orientation that led me to start working on the book, The Hip Hop Generation. So I get the book deal for The Hip Hop Generation after several years at The Source. I decide after a year, I was supposed to write the book in a year. A year goes by, the book's not done. I decide I'm going to leave The Source to write this book. So I leave The Source. It's 99. I write the book in a year. The woman who signed the book ended up not there still. I got a new editor when I was finished. This dude hated the book. He did everything to kill the book, but he was forced to deal with it. So a year goes by. I wrote the book. A year goes by. The guy, I can't work with him. Finally, one day, my agent is like, the best thing to do sometimes is nothing. And I mean, that sounded good for about 3 or 4 months. After 6 months, I'm like, man, I got to do something with this. So I call the guy up and he's gone. A woman answers the phone. Her name is Sarah McNally. She actually runs a bookstore now in New York City called McNally Robinson Booksellers. And Sarah became my editor. She loved the book. And then that was how The Hip Hop Generation got done. She also signed my book, Why White Kids Love Hip Hop. And so then by this point, I'm pretty much working independently. Once I left The Source, I've been an independent writer and lecturer and entrepreneur doing hip hop work since then. So
I would love to know, as we get ready to wrap this up, because I want to kind of come back to where we started from. So, and I'd love to know about the impetus for the decision to create the Hip Hop Political Convention and Rap Session.
Yeah, those are two really great questions. Man, the convention came out of it's a good question because both of them they're all interlinked. So the convention came out of when I wrote the book The Hip Hop Generation. There's a part in the book where I talk about the need for a national convening like the Gary, Indiana Black Political Convention. That was kind of, I think, how the book ends. And so when I started lecturing on the book and I was going around, this is another thing that really influenced me was when I was at The Source, I had a budget and we would do stories on hip hop in different parts of the country. So this is the first time I began to travel around the country to begin to meet other people from other parts of the country that were doing hip hop work. This became important for the convention later on. because that's how we organize the convention. So I met a lot of people around the country because I was lecturing on hip hop. I want to say I met Davey D during those years, and me and Davey got to be close. And Davey, you know, he hits you up once he knows you. And so Davey said to me, like, now you wrote this book, now what we gonna do? And so I did a lecture at Harvard that was hosted by the Hip Hop Archive, and it was, I believe, 2002 or 3, and Raz Baraka was there. It was a hip hop education roundtable, one of the first ones they did. And in my presentation, I talk about the need for a hip hop generation version of the National Black Political Convention. And so after that meeting, Raz Baraka came up to me and said, we should do that. I'd known Raz because I knew his father. I met Raz through his father. I knew his father first, just as and same as Ta-Nehisi Coates. I've known Ta-Nehisi Coates' father for years before I met him. But Raz was like, we should do that. So Raz knew a friend of mine that I went to college with, another activist who we were student activists together. His name is Hasim Shamari. Raz was also friends with Baye Adolfo, and my friend Hasim was friends with Baye. The four of us were the nucleus that began to plan the National Hip Hop Political Convention. But that was some of how it kind of got started. We then started, our first meeting was at Third World Press. Then we met in LA at Maulana Karinga's home base. We met in the Bay Area at an activist at God, I can't think of what the brother's name is right now. So we did these local organizing meetings in different cities to get people who were activists in the room to talk about creating local organizing committees to send folks to the National Hip Hop Political Convention. We brought 4,000 people to Newark in 2004 to create and endorse a political agenda for the hip hop generation, and that was the focus of the National Hip Hop Political Convention. So they all kind of grew out of the everything that I've done for the most part has grown out of something else I was working on before that.
So with rap sessions, would you say that's a continuation of those kind of initial organizing?
Yes. Rap sessions, I started after we ended the convention, and because the convention revealed so much. You know, one of the people that I met during the convention planning, I was living in Cleveland by this point, was Max Sanford. I think it was Stanford. Can't remember how he pronounces his last name, but he was one of the folks in the black. Oh my God. Oh, I can't think of. He was an activist out of the '60s, and he had a big influence on the way I was kind of starting to think about, you know, what was the meaning of this convention. So during the convention, I'm paying attention to everything as much as I can. And one of the things that I saw was some of the tendencies. One, people just weren't ready. A lot of young people, even though they were like, people were into hip hop, but people weren't ready to talk. Like, white kids were into hip hop, black kids were into hip hop, Latino kids were into hip hop, Asian kids were into hip hop, but they really didn't have any way of talking about political issues across these racial divides. And so that was something that stuck out in my mind about the convention, because ultimately the convention was like over 90% black. Most of the people that came to the convention were black. And so that struck me. I didn't expect that. We learned other things at the convention that, you know, about politics, about gender. People weren't really, they didn't have their gender weight up. So it was a lot of things that we learned during the convention that I then tried to pour that into rap sessions so that by the next election, we would be better prepared. And so that's what rap sessions became. How do you begin to politically educate people in between elections so that by the time you get to the elections, people are ready, but not necessarily educating them politically just to participate in elections, but just educating them to think about politics and community, and to think about politics as community. How do you build community? How do you organize for change? How do you organize so that you can transform your community? And so that's how I started thinking about rap sessions. And so the other thing that I didn't want to do was I didn't want to undermine existing organizations. So rap sessions travel around. So what we try to do is we try to bring local activists in, either on the panels or in breakout sessions, because we're leaving. So, but we want people to then join these organizations. So those were some of the things that we did with rap sessions from the beginning to try to begin to build community. But the idea was, out of the convention, how do you get people to think more deeply about cross-racial political organizing, gender, issues like that, so that you're better prepared? Because already by that point, the public school system, the whole idea of civic education was already out the window. And largely a part of why we got things happening like this so-called, what they call a riot, which was really, an attempt to overthrow the government. Because you got a big mass of uneducated people who don't know, they don't have a basic civic education. And so they don't really, they're listening to this guy. They don't read, obviously, or they're reading stuff and they don't know who the source is. And I think all of that is a real dangerous cocktail.
As this is my last question, because we're at time.
Yes, sir.
If you were able to give, and you actually have the benefit of having a young man who's just a child who's just graduated from college. If you were giving advice to your younger self, maybe not that second grade self, but maybe like that middle school or high school self, that you wish someone had given to you, what would that word of advice be for that younger
Man, that's a tough question, man. I mean, I the first thing that came to mind when you're saying that is, I think about the hardest lessons. One of the hardest lessons I think that people have is to learn to believe in themselves. I think that nobody can tell you how to do that, but you have to learn. If you're going to do anything significant, you're going to have to believe in yourself, because it's going to always be doubters in your ear. People are saying, oh, you can't do that. Oh, you shouldn't do that. Oh, you're not good enough to do that. Why are you doing that? Because you have the vision. It's your vision. It's your unique vision. And you have to see it through. So I would say learning to believe in yourself. People believe in a lot of things. And a lot of times they believe in things because they don't believe in themselves. So I think that to me is probably that's been one of the hardest lessons. I'd say another thing is, and I don't know if you can even avoid this, is sometimes you got to make some dumb decisions, man, dumb financial decisions. I mean, some of the things that I've spent money on trying to build stuff have just been heartbreaking when I think back to that stuff. But once you learn that lesson, it's no get it quick. It just doesn't exist. It's a grind, and you got to do the work. And if you do the work, when the time comes, you're going to have the goods and you're going to be prepared.
Bakari Kitwana, I want to thank you so much. There's one important thing I learned from this interview, which is when I call you about something and it doesn't seem like a natural fit, and you say, I don't know if anybody's going to care about that. I'm not listening to you. Because this was one of the most compelling, interesting interviews. Your journey, I can't wait for the autobiography. Thank you so much for joining us to share these gems, these jewels with young people, and maybe the not so young who want to follow in your footsteps. I really appreciate it personally.
Yeah, I thank you, and I appreciate you. And I first encountered you, I want to say it was the 90s, man. You were still at, was it not the 90s, or was it somebody?
I met you when you were doing a tour for Hip Hop Generation. You actually mentioned the Words, Beats, and Life.
I thought I met y'all before that at Maryland. That's why I knew about it.
No,
you were at Maryland what years?
So I was there. I graduated in 2002, but I think you came to lecture in 2003.
Yeah, see,
so
I met you guys before that, or at least I knew about the organization before that from coming to University of Maryland, and I think that was why I wrote about the organization in the book.
Yeah, exactly. So I've been following you ever since, and I really appreciate not just the work you've done in the abstract, but literally the investments you've made in the work we do in DC and the hip hop organizations do all over the world. So many people are indebted to you, and your your journalism. I was going to say scholarship, but I remember you was like, your journalism, your ability to tell stories. So I thank God that nobody discouraged your second grade self from continuing to tell those stories because they've changed the whole world. So I appreciate your time, brother. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you and the work you do.
Thank you very much, sir. All right, everybody. So we've got one more discussion tomorrow with DJ D Painter, also known as Dominic Painter. He was actually the founder or the executive director of one of DC's first hip hop organizations called the Midnight Forum. He's going to talk about some of that work and the work he's been doing on radio ever since. This is all part of the inaugural Alternative Spring Break, brought to you by Words Beats. Spring Break, Winter Break. I guess I want to be out in the sun. Consider encouraging children in your life or young people in your life to enroll in our program. Let me just show a couple commercials just in case you missed them.
Some ideas, they shake you out of your sleep like when a toddler creeps. Totality of the deep, the mere thought of an unconscious manifestation carried out with the beat. Positive charged protons creating neural explosions. Time hiccups when fingers and pads touch. Dead air smiles because it knows what's coming. The countenance of the clock claps hands. The choreography of the knot slaps jams. And you be like, who made this? Vertebrae responding to the call so bad they make a B-girl curve the wall. Picture this. Underneath the margins, your words can breathe. Got your listeners tilting isosceles the way you holding volcanic quills, spitting decrees. Better believe it flows like these. You got gills, screaming at daffodils or dreaming in mandrills, derivative of skills. You're built in the workshop, rocking with Ra. Cause in life, the woodshed don't stop. It don't stop. It don't stop. Don't stop.